Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Encounters with the Unknown, Volume 6, Story 1. This happened back in the mid-60s in West Tennessee on our small family farm. My brother, one of his teen buddies, and our mother were the witnesses. Dad wasn't home, and the rest of his kids weren't home. The boys were about 12 or 13 years old. We had a lot of dogs. A lot of these dogs were huge dogs, too. A lot of hounds and shepherd mixes. There were at least 8 or 10, maybe more. Those of you who remember back then know that country farm dogs were real dogs. Fearless, naturally aggressive to strangers, as well as extremely protective of their lands and owners, especially the kids on the farm. Mutts they may have been, but they meant business. Brother and his buddy decided to camp out in the back 40 in the woods behind the barn. They used one of those heavy-duty green canvas military pup tents. This is summertime, hot, muggy. They set up camp about the middle of the 40. The whole time they're setting up, the dogs that had followed them kept looking off through the trees to the northeast and growling with their hackles up. The boys didn't think much of it, but definitely noticed it, and it was still light, after all. They just figured other dogs or coyotes or maybe a bobcat was back in the woods. There was a dirt road that bordered that side of our property, then miles of dense, old hardwood, old-growth forest. There were no houses anywhere near ours in that direction. As they got the camp set up and the fire going, and by this time it was dark, they kept noticing the dogs were growing more attentive and restless. There was also a storm blowing in from the southwest. They could hear the low, distant rumble of thunder way off in the distance. But this is still natural for that area of the country and common in the summers, and really no cause for concern. They got the fire going and were making their grub when the dogs all became instantly alert and began to growl and move out to investigate, still in that northeast direction, into those thick woods. Some of the dogs actually ran into the woods, and the boys could hear that the dogs were getting really excited. Some of the dogs actually held back and stayed close to the boys. These dogs were actually trembling and whimpering, something they'd never seen our dogs do. They were just under their feet. They could tell they were scared. My brother whistled the dogs back, and they came running with their tails tucked and looking over their shoulders. It was obvious they were scared too. When the dogs got back to my brother and his buddy, they were right under their feet, whimpering and whining and shaking, hackles up, and they surrounded the boys, and that really spooked them because they could tell the dogs were wanting to protect them. The boys knew something or somebody was out there watching them. They could even sense it. The thunderstorm was getting closer and the wind was picking up, plus the night sounds had stopped. Back then, in Tennessee in summer, you could just about determine where anyone or anything was in the woods or around you just by the sounds of the night insects, and frogs and all. When something is there, they all go quiet, and it's really eerie, and with the cloud cover and all, it was just a southern pitch-black night. Well, my brother and his buddy decided they moved the camp up closer to the house, so they break camp, and the whole time the dogs are just freaking out and even growling, and their hackles are all up, and the boys could tell that whatever was out there couldn't be good. They finally got the tent set up in the backyard. The dogs, again, are underfoot the whole time. The dirt road was closer to the house than the back 40 woods, too. About the time they got the tent up, Mama comes out on the back porch and asks what's wrong, and why are the dogs carrying on so. She could tell the dogs were upset, and the thunderstorm was getting closer. The boys told her how the dogs had been acting, and she could see the dogs were alerting on something up across the road in the woods. So she told them to just come into the house. So they came on in. Well, the dogs kept barking and just going crazy. The storm was moving in and the wind had really picked up, but it wasn't raining, just lightning and thundering and wind gusts. Mama would go out on the back porch and look, but could never see anything. After a couple of hours, the dogs went ballistic. I mean, like they were going to kill something. Mama said they were almost screaming, like she'd never heard a dog make those kind of sounds. They were so frightened and so vicious. So Mama and my brother got up and looked out the windows into the backyard where the tent was set up, about 60 feet from the corner of the house under a white oak tree. Mama is looking out the bathroom window and my brother's looking out my bedroom window. Across the dirt road, moving through the trees, was a glowing, transparent, man-shaped green light, moving just like a person would move if they were taking their sweet own time walking on a sunny day. The dogs were just screaming and surrounding this thing. Some of them were lunging at it and others were just howling like it was Judgment Day. The thing just ignored them. That man-shaped green glowing thing just kept moving right towards the tent and the house. It never hesitated or paused or anything, even with all the dogs going crazy. It was like those dogs were not even there. This thing walked right up to that tent, stopped, and turned. I looked directly at my mom through the bathroom window. Then it squatted down, just like an old man would, and opened the flap of the tent and leaned partly inside. The dogs were still lunging, growling, snarling, barking, screaming, jumping, running, surrounding this thing. It didn't even notice them. The whole tent lit up just like you'd turned a green lantern on inside. It stayed in there a few moments. The whole tent just lit up and glowed real bright. Then it just leaned back out, stood up, and looked at Mom again through the bathroom window. It just stood there for a few minutes, looking at the house and at her. Then it just turned around and walked back in the exact same path, up the hill, back across the road, back into the trees, with the dogs still going after it. They followed it up to the road and kept raising Cain until it disappeared way back into the woods, out of sight. Same place it had come out of, still acting like those dogs weren't even there. The next morning, Mom and the boys all went outside and walked around the tent. Checked the tent. Nothing looked out of place. The dogs would not go near it. They would come close and their hackles would rise, and they'd whine, and a couple raised a leg and marked the perimeter, but they sniffed around that spot for days where their hackles raised. But they all described what they saw as a green, glowing see-through man. The one thing that did stick out was that they could not see his feet. They could make out all the rest of the features, but not its feet. Mama always thought that was even weirder. Our family was and is Christian. Mom said she just said a prayer, but for some reason she said she wasn't afraid that bad. She was mighty concerned, and she said if it had kept coming towards the house, she would have been really scared. But she said when she said that little prayer, she felt okay. This is a true story. Mama kept us kids close to the house for a while after that, and it's been discussed many a time between us all. Story number 2. My story takes place when I was about 13 or 14, maybe around 1975, 76. My dad didn't hunt or fish, but I couldn't get enough of it. My parents did love to camp though, and my dad was always up to taking me out. The day before deer season in southern Arizona, we drove up a canyon of the mountain outside of town. While the town we lived in was desert with an elevation around 2,200 feet, this mountain was a little over 10,000 feet. We drove up the canyon to almost the end of the road and set up camp. There were no other hunters by nightfall. We were sleeping in the camper when around midnight we were woken up by a vehicle pulling up beside us, and I figured it was more hunters getting in late. Moments later, there was this hard knocking on the door. Scared the heck out of us, but I grabbed my rifle and my dad opened the door, and there are 2 law officers standing there. It seemed 2 inmates from the minimum security prison on the other side of the mountain escaped, and escapees tend to head for the saddle on the mountain that was at the head of the canyon we were camped in, and they advised us to leave. We threw everything into the camper and got out of there as fast as we could. When we got home, we decided to get a few hours of sleep and head back up and hunt the lower part of the canyon. We left before sunup, and my dad said we'd drive back to the campsite as we had forgotten a folding table and an axe that we'd left under the truck. As we were about a quarter mile from the camp, we ran into the 2 officers who had picked up our stuff. The 2 inmates hadn't been seen, so we turned around and went back down the canyon. I decided to hunt inside the canyon while my dad took a nap in the truck and hiked to almost the top of it. There was a huge rock outcropping jutting out near the top, and I walked out to it just to take in the view. I could see the road the way we had come up to the main canyon to my left, at the end of the side canyon I was in, and to my right was the head of this canyon. At my back, about 30 yards away, was a thicket of manzanita brush that covered these lower slopes. To go up to the top of the ridge would require me to make my way through the thicket. As I stood there scanning the opposite slope, I got the feeling of being watched from the thicket, and that I should turn around and go back. It had been a steep climb up, and I wanted to get to the top, but couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave, so I headed back down. When I got to the bottom, I turned around to look back and look up the canyon, and there on the rock outcropping I had been standing on, which was about 400 to 500 yards away, I could make out a figure standing. What I did next was really stupid, and I'd never do it again now, but I swung my rifle up to see who it was through the scope, since I didn't have binoculars. There was a man in matching shirt and pants with no coat, strange since it had snowed that night, and not carrying a rifle, also strange since it was opening day. He saw me looking at him and ran into the thicket behind him. Not strange since some stupid kid was pointing a rifle in his direction. Other than being embarrassed at my own stupidity and hoping he didn't come down and kick my skinny butt, I didn't think too much about it until that evening when we were leaving and we ran into the two officers again and asked how the search was going. What they told me gives me the heebie-jeebies to this day. They had caught one of the prisoners after he had stabbed one of the bloodhounds trailing him to death with a homemade shiv up in the manzanita thicket near the rock outcropping. It had been him I'd seen standing up there, and he had probably been watching me from the thicket. If I had gone in there, I don't like to think what he would have done. Those feelings everyone talks about being watched, they're the real deal. No doubt in my mind. Story number 3. This takes place 2001, 2002. I was in the Minnesota National Guard and was sent to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, to be the Op 4 for an Arkansas unit headed over to Iraq. Our platoon got dropped off deep in the backwoods to run our little raids and ambushes and whatnot for the first phase of the op. At this time, only one or two of us had GPS devices, my platoon sergeant being one of them. He came over to me and we checked out the map, and his Garmin both showed an old unnamed graveyard near our area. I just figured it was some old family plot from the time before the government swallowed up the land to make the fort. No big deal, we thought. Well, on the 4th or 5th night that we were there, we changed our tune a bit. We had a soldier with us who was Buddhist, born and raised in Nepal. He was a real hard worker and super quiet. All I ever heard him really say was, "Yes, Sergeant, no, Sergeant," that kind of thing. Well, we settled in that night to start running radio watch shifts and to get a little sleep for once at night. The sergeants had all decided we would take a shift at the radio, and I was into mine, talking to the PSG. Pitch black, sounds of a deep south forest all around us, hot and muggy in the middle of June. Out of nowhere, we hear a blood-curdling scream come from the direction of our quiet soldier. My mind thought immediately of all the venomous critters we have been avoiding all week so far. Scorpions, copperheads, and tarantulas had all been shooed away from our hocks. The screaming went on for what seemed like an eternity to us running out there to give help. We got there and the soldier was in the arms of his battle buddy, just shaking and sobbing. We asked if he was bit or stung or whatever, and his battle buddy said no. The battle buddy, soldier named Lore, said that the other fellow had gone a little way off towards the unmarked graveyard to relieve himself. The soldier said that while he was doing it, he felt something touch his shoulder, so he turned to see what it was. He said he saw an old woman with claws, and that then she grabbed him and tried to pull him close to her. That's when he screamed and ran back to the patrol base. So now we were there, the whole platoon shaken up by the sheer terror in his screams. Didn't see anything, heard anything, but we had no real reason not to believe him. Some of us sort of rationalized that we were all pretty tired after a long day. Maybe he was dozing while doing his business and leaned back into a bush or tree branches and it startled him. Awake in his sleeping mind, dreamt it all up. At the same time, we couldn't really be sure. It was an interesting night, to say the least, as a whole platoon of tough infantrymen suddenly tightened up to battle buddies just to be safe, and slept fitfully with one eye open. I don't know what it is, but for me, the Deep South is the one part of the country that really seems paranormal. It's the one place that I'm always looking over my shoulder, and my fight or flight instincts seem ready to go whenever I'm there. Next story. This story took place in a teeny trailer at a campground. Not exactly wilderness, but still heavily wooded. I was 12, almost 13 years old. The campground just had this strange feeling. Felt like it belonged in the holler in West Virginia or something, not in New England. It was run by a couple who were around at odd hours. There was a pool and little general store within sight of the trailer to the right. Way down to the left, out of sight, and just barely in hearing range when they were loud, was larger trailers and tent sites. All of this was backed up to the edge of fairly dense woods. Around us, there were a few smaller trailers, but no one in any of them at all. It just felt odd and deserted, but I wasn't uncomfortable at this point. One night, my best friend and I were in the trailer, and my mother and her friend were on the picnic tables about 30 or 40 feet away. We'd watched the movie Aladdin, and at some point, during or after, I got up to shut the light on the far window over the kitchen table. This was a tiny trailer, maybe 10 steps across and barely room to pass each other if you went sideways. The kitchen table was the second bed, little as hell. We were on the living room bed, so I went the 10 steps. The far window and table were kind of recessed. The bathroom and living room bed were up a step and narrower. My friend could not see the window from the bed. When I reached for the light, something growled outside the window. It was deep, but not necessarily loud. But the depth to it sounded big and high, probably near the top of the window. I froze. Took a good 5 seconds before I could turn to my friend to see if he'd heard it. I got a genuinely blank what? I bolted those 10 steps and literally collapsed into the bed. My knees were too weak to jump. That wasn't the part that really bothers me, though. A few beats after I hit the bed, something hit the trailer near the top and hit it. The trailer's side and back, where the windows were and where it hit, were against the woods. Trees touched it. Now, there was a step outside to get into the trailer and room enough for my 5'8" mom to stand up with some room. It hit the top edge of that trailer above the bed, and my friend and I were in hard enough to reverberate through the bed. What weirds me out more is my mom and her friend, again 30 or 40 feet away, heard nothing but us yell. They assumed we were playing around. They still didn't believe us. My friend did not hear the growl, but we both knew it wasn't on the roof. Nothing jumped onto us. It was the side, near the top, and one concentrated spot, not like a body slam. It could have been a bear or a mountain lion, but this was Western Massachusetts. Besides which, I feel like either of those would have gone for the two vulnerable adults at the picnic table, or at least been noticed by them. The side it hit was the side nearest the table. And yeah, I've been given the Bigfoot suggestion. For me, the jury is out on that one, but I don't find it impossible. If I have a problem with it, it's the same with a bear or mountain lion. Why it took more interest in us than the adults out in the open. I'm still genuinely uncomfortable walking into a room with a window open at night. Next story. Well, this house we used to live in, the house came with bad karma, and in truth, that's an understatement. The prior owner had killed himself and his son, who was dying of cancer. His wife had died in a car wreck a few years prior, and from what we heard, was never right after it. What happened was, when he found out his son had leukemia, it broke him. Back then, it was a death sentence. He brought his son home to die. He was almost 12. He lingered on much longer than anyone thought he could, but when it was clear his time was very short, he shot his son, then himself in the head with a .22. The house sat for some time, but as I said, my dad didn't care what he was getting, as long as it was a great deal. My bedroom was the room Mr. Gerald and his son died in. Now please understand, this whole story wasn't on the paperwork for the house. My mother got this from the people in the church we all went to, and some of Mr. Gerald's surviving kin. If my mom had known of all of this, we would never have moved in. She wasn't happy about our moving off the land in the first place. The trouble began almost instantly. My mom and dad woke me up that first Saturday we were there and asked me if I thought I was cute. I had no clue what they were talking about, but I soon did. Every drawer in the kitchen was pulled all the way out. Of course, I denied it, but my dad beat my butt with a belt all the same. A few days later, the famous chair shuffle crap began. Dad thought he would sneak up on me by going out of the house and coming in through the back. The look on his face when he didn't find me in the kitchen moving chairs, well, the house was settling. Right, this damn place was already 100 years old. It went like that for a long time. Faucets, chairs, drawers, light switches. My mom had someone come over and pray over the house and bless it. Nope, didn't make any difference. While the chairs were all pushed into one corner, never saw that before. My big mistake was when I challenged it. I screamed and yelled and told it that it was a joke. Chairs and silverware? Wow. And a light switch once in a while? I begged it to bring it on. I was tired of my mom being jumpy, my dad drinking so he wouldn't think about it. That was a very bad idea. Almost instantly, the drawers, chairs, light switches all stopped. But really weird stuff started going on with me. I couldn't get my German Shepherd in my room for love nor money. Hell, this dog slept on the foot of my bed. I started to get odd chills. All the hair on my neck and arms would stand up. I would wake up and feel like I could barely breathe, and my room could be as cold as ice. I had a small school desk in my room, and I was forever losing pens and pencils, and it would be as quick as me going to the bathroom and coming back. Now, I told my mom about this, and she told me once to pray more. That was her answer to anything she didn't understand. Well, the night that finished me off was several months later. The day before, some of our cousins brought over a Ouija board, and we were playing with it. Nothing earth-shattering revealed. I was lying on the floor with a pillow doubled up against the metal frame of the bed. God, this is tough just to think about it. And I reached up over by my head to put my hands behind my head when something grabbed my arm and jerked me against the side of the rail. I could feel it as plain as anything. I put my other hand up and pushed, and it jerked again. I freaked out and screamed bloody murder and snatched my arm back. I made 3 jumps to get to the folks in the living room. I had 3 really deep scratches on my arm, 2 on one side, 1 on the other. I told my mom what happened. My dad hears it, charges in my room. I passed out when he stuck his arm under the bed. When I came to, my whole bedroom was upside down. My dad train wrecked it. I don't know if you ever believe me. The gouges on my arms were real, as was my sheer terror. I got to sleep on the couch until almost a year later when we moved to the city. Mom must have had someone from every church in that place come over. A lot of noise still went on, but nothing like that. I hate to even think of what would have happened if I'd been pulled under that bed. I know one thing that did happen. I listened very carefully before I dismissed things out of hand. That event was a life changer. Next story. A group of friends and I had a weekend-long caving camping trip together, and only one of us brought along a tent that was big enough for 4. Trouble was, it was 5 guys. He swore that he had a tent big enough for everyone and that we didn't need to bring our own. Lesson learned, don't take anything for granted. Fortunately, we were skinny enough to handle being squeezed in altogether. I ended up along one of the side walls of the tent and was all right since we all had individual sleeping bags and mats. It was already late and all of us turned in at roughly the same time. The moon was half full and the night cloudless, which allowed at least a muted amount of light in the tent. Sometime during the night, I felt something nudging me. Groggily, I thought it was one of my friends beside me until I realized that I was being nudged from the tent wall side. The nudging was coming from the outside. I froze and waited. It felt like something was trying to burrow underneath our tent, but my ears picked up heavy breathing from higher up, much higher up. My back was to the tent wall, so I was able to ascertain that everyone was still in the tent. To make matters worse, the top of the tent rustled and then was shook violently for a couple of seconds. One of the other guys woke up quickly, and in the dim light, I could see him sitting up, and he shouted, "What the F?" which woke up 2 more. The first guy suddenly got real quiet, and we agreed later that morning that we could hear something moving off away from us. The other two weren't too sure about what because they were still clawing their way out of their deep sleep cycle. The fifth slept on blissfully as if nothing in the world could have wakened them. The two that woke up fell back to sleep, but the other fellow who shouted still remained sitting up. I still remained where I was, lying prone and just watching my friend and listening for anything. Eventually, he lay back down and I fell asleep lightly after that. Next morning, the guy who shouted and I went out of the tent and walked around carefully. I related my own experiences of being nudged and hearing the breathing before the tent was shaken. He said that he was having a nightmare and the shaking is what snapped him out of it. The others passed it all off as deer or an elk since we were high enough up for that possibility. But there were no tracks that we could find at all anywhere. We spent another night out there, Saturday night, before finishing our cave exploration the next day, Sunday, and heading home. My friend and I do like to joke around and do the scary stuff once in a while upon each other. We'll admit it hours, days, and even weeks later that we pulled this or that joke, but on this incident, none of us did. Even years later, after I moved away, my friend who shouted spoke of the incident and still has nightmares about it. I simply file it away deep in my own memory and try not to think of it, but I find myself still remembering it. To this day, I do not sleep out under the stars anymore like I used to, and whenever I'm in a tent, I have a large Bowie Rambo-type knife that I keep under my sleeping pad where I can get to it. I've also stopped camping out by my lonesome anymore, though I used to all the time. I find myself too reminiscent of this and the other unknown experience out in the woods camping. I still love camping, but still fight to ward off the feeling of dread as the night closes in around us. Paranoid? Maybe. But this and other experiences I've had in the wilderness make me preferable to err on the side of caution. Next story. This was many years ago. I lived in a small town in Texas, and we only had a couple of bars, and both were kind of rough. Me and my girlfriends went to the lesser of the two evils on the weekends to dance and shoot pool. The bar was always packed, and of course, there were always fights. But up until then, my experience, I'd never had any trouble. None of us had. The guys treated us nice, and we always had a good time, and we always got home safely. Then one night, a group of bikers came in, some really scary-looking ones. Now, I'm not knocking bikers. I have known some in my life that turned out to be really good friends, even after this happened. But there was just an air about this group of guys that caused us to be a little wary. I had to go to the ladies' room, and in order to get to the hallway that led to the bathroom, I had to walk past this group of guys. They were all hanging around the last pool table by the wall where the hallway to the bathroom was. One of them was the biggest man I have ever seen in my life. He was a giant of a man, and his head was shaved and was tattooed, and he wore only a leather jacket with no shirt and lots of chains and stuff. Anyway, he was leaning against the wall by the hallway, and as I got closer, I looked up and he was watching me. Some of the others were too, and they started doing catcalls, making comments, everything you would expect a group of guys to do. So I walked past him and went to the ladies' room. When I came back out, I see that he had his arms up on the walls, and he has to bend his head down in order to look into the hallway. And he has the doorway I have to go through blocked with his huge body. He was waiting for me. Talk about scared. Of course, I stopped in my tracks for a few seconds, which I'm sure he expected me to. He was grinning from ear to ear. I'm sure most of you know that any girl that goes to this kind of bar has to have a backbone. Be a little on the tough side or she wouldn't be there. But looking back, I realized how foolish I was for going to a place like that and the risk I was taking, although at the time, until this happened, that had never entered my mind. None of my group of friends were afraid. How foolish we were. I finally decided that I had to move. I had to get back to my friends. So I just walked towards him until I was right in front of him. I said, "Hi." No answer. Just that grin. So I said, "Look, I came here to have a good time, dance, and shoot pool. I don't want any trouble. Please, don't let this turn into something I won't be able to forget for the rest of my life. Please let me pass." He stood there for a few seconds and then said, "You might want to think a little more about what you just said to me. Someone who looks like you in a place like this is asking for trouble, little girl. You really shouldn't be coming to places like this." And then he stepped aside and said, "Have a good night." Talk about scared. Me and my friends sat there a while longer talking about what just happened and then decided to leave. On the way out the door, I looked over at the big guy and said, "Thanks." He said, "Have a good night." Next story. I'm self-employed and I head off into Europe every September on my motorbike with hammock and tarp, generally seeking sunshine after the usual dismal British summer. Now, Western Europe is obviously densely populated, so it's difficult to find yourself many miles from civilization, but you really don't have to go too far from the main highways to find yourself in very secluded areas. September is good for me. The weather is still generally fantastic, i.e. not honking down with rain all day long, and Europeans all seem to holiday in August. On September 1st, they scurry back to work, the roads are quiet, and the whole continent sort of slumps and winds down before the onset of autumn and winter. Because I'm trundling around on my motorbike, and because I'm alone, I tend to try and use proper campsites, even though I believe I could just peel into the woods in rural France, for example, and set up for the night. I'm too wary of waking up with a Southern European itinerant's blade at my throat to be rough camping, as appealing as it is. Anyway, my first story sees me in Italy. Been riding down the coast from the Pisa area. It's late afternoon. The sun is starting to drop towards the horizon, and I'm looking for somewhere safe to doss. One of Johnny Foreigner's little tricks is to place a sign on the road saying something like "camping, 5 minutes," and an arrow pointing off to some country lane. The 5 minutes meaning 5 minutes. Now, 5 minutes to me means perhaps 5 miles, but not to our European cousins. It means anything up to 15 miles. There'll be a few other signs, and you'll be trundling up and down looking for a campsite which is nowhere near the main road and the sign. After searching for one of these mythical campsites in a heavily wooded stretch, I finally lost patience. It was getting towards twilight. The 5 minutes had turned into 90 minutes. I spot a house and ride in to see if they will let me camp on their land. There appears to be no one home, but as I'm leaving, a chap runs out and he agrees to let me set up wherever I like in the trees. By torchlight, I got pitched, fed, and hit the sack early. There's not a soul about, and I can see the house in the distance, unlit. Sometime later, I wake to hear a boop sound. It strikes me as being above me. The noise repeats and repeats at a regular interval, a couple of seconds apart. Then it moves, booping as it goes circling my camp. It's loud and the same pitch, same regularity all the time. Then I hear another noise, the same, from the left side of me. These noises ping back and forth and move about somewhere above me. By now, I'm out of the hammock, trying to light up whatever's bugging me. I'm used to being out at night. I'm a fairly handy chap, and I can see a long way around me with a light. I'm definitely alone. I'm a keen birder, and although I tell myself the noise is some kind of nocturnal bird, I have no idea what it is. I will confess right now, I was actually afraid. The noises drift away. I got back into bed, and it's not long before they're back, slowly circling. So, I didn't get much sleep that night, and just as dawn was approaching, the noises drifted away again for good. Upon packing up, I stopped at the house, and the chap came out to see me away. I had to ask him, "What the hell is that bird that's making that beeping sound?" "Ah, you mean boop?" "Yes, indeed," I tell him. "It kept me awake all night. I have no idea what makes the noise. We hear it here sometimes too." And that's it. Nothing more to say to him, is there? Baffled, I rode away. A couple of miles away, there was some sort of military outpost, perhaps Coast Guard, set on the cliff top. The noise is either a bird or some sort of automatic surrender device the Italians are working on. Now, on the same trip, the same coast, just south of Rome, I was headed down towards Monte Cassino to see where my granddad battled the Hun with a few of his mates. As before, the day is drawing to a close, but weather is not nice. Although a warm breeze is coming in from the coast, there are serious black clouds looming. Twilight comes early, and the road takes on that electric glow. There is going to be a hell of a storm soon. This time, there's no nice bona fide family campsites around. Just off the road, there's some woods, and there are some caravans and encampments dotted about, less holiday campsites and more gypsy camp, I think it's fair to say. I should say that I'm not prejudiced, but Europe is full of sites where itinerants set up for the whole summer while they pick fruit or whatever other low-paid work they can do. To poor Roma, I must look like Christmas dinner, a plump Englishman who obviously has his passport and lots of euros on him. I try to distance myself from them because it's my experience that they will try to liberate anything that isn't securely fastened. And if it is, they always seem to have some tools to unfasten it. I'm already through the gates by the time I realize what sort of campsite it is. But the site is large, and the other residents are spread out. The sky is getting blacker by the minute, and out at sea I can see a waterspout forming. I took myself to a point close to the beach, got the tarp and the hammock up as the breeze started to pick up and the gloom grows into the twilight, and then it's nighttime. Yes, I know it isn't the cleverest trick, but there was no way I was carrying on along the coast road perched on my motorbike. I opted for shelter and hoped for the best. Again, I was asleep in no time, and when the storm landed, it was a corker. I woke to bright flashes of lightning and instantaneous crashes of thunder. At that point, I could also hear trucks passing me, heading off the beach, and indistinct voices shouting. Not one or two, though, it sounded like dozens. I lifted the tarp, couldn't see anything, decided that if there was anything going on out there, I'd probably not be welcome to the party. Between the engines rolling past, the crashes of thunder, and the flash lightning, it was like a war zone. On and on it went, though the strong wind and the rain had died down totally. After some time, it just petered out, and I fell asleep. Those of you who are on the ball might have guessed already. I was camped out just off the beach where the Allies had come ashore in January of 1944, a few miles north of Anzio. After their initial landing, General Lucas failed to exploit the lack of cohesive defenses, giving the Germans chance to regroup and contain the beachhead. The Allies remained bogged down for nearly 5 months before breaking out and sustained 43,000 killed, lost, or wounded in that time. Before visiting the Anzio war cemeteries and the museum the next day, I was unaware of the scale of the landings and casualties. I thought Naples and Salerno were the ingress points for the Allied invasions. Makes you think, doesn't it?